Welcome, friends, to the APUSH DIG. For our topic this week, we turn our critical historical gaze to the age of Jackson, or the U.S. from 1828 to 1848. This was an era of rapid economic change that influenced reactions across the spectrum in society. Along with these socio-economic transformations, there was a crucial political development we must consider: the rapid expansion of democracy in the United States in the 1820s through the 1840s. States, one by one, lessened the voting requirements until finally the United States had achieved universal white male suffrage. While the vote was expanding to white men regardless of property owning qualifications, many states also stripped the vote from free black men. Further, this expansion of white democracy did not expand to women. It was an era of increasing democracy and political participation for white men, and continued subjugation of everyone else. The nation's transition to a more participatory democracy was achieved by expanding suffrage from a system based on property ownership to one based on voting by all white men, and it was accompanied by the growth of political parties. Historians use the phrase Jacksonian democracy to describe this period. It's not that President Andrew Jackson changed state laws himself to allow common white men to vote for him. It's that because state laws had changed to allow common white men to vote, it greatly benefited candidates who proclaimed to stand for the common white man. Andrew Jackson is the perfect example of this. In this period of expanding Jacksonian democracy, let's examine the politics of the common man, the common white man. We already mentioned universal white male suffrage. We also see the return of the two-party political system. The Democratic-Republican hegemony of the era of good feelings had been torn apart by the amazing increase in popular political participation across the nation. The Jeffersonian Old Republicans became the Democratic Party, the great-great-grandfather of today's Democratic Party. We could look at Andrew Jackson as the leader of this party. In opposition to that Jacksonian Democrats, the national Republican wing within the old Democratic-Republican bloc splits into a new party led by men like Henry Clay, called the Whigs. Jackson and the Democrats looked to Thomas Jefferson for their political and philosophical guidance. The Whigs looked to Alexander Hamilton. See, I told you we could not escape that ideological rivalry. These parties became mass parties, seeking to bring in as many of the new common white male voters as possible. We see party nominating conventions, primary contests, and just a general increase in the number of elected positions. Finally, we also see the politics of patronage born in this era, what critics will later call the spoil system, or the gifting of federal positions to the supporters of a political candidate. Andrew Jackson was elected the 7th president in the 1828 election. His presidency becomes the most consequential presidency until Abraham Lincoln decades later. Here are the 4 most important things to know about the Jackson years as president. First, presidential power. Checks and balances did not matter to Andrew Jackson. He believed he was elected by the people to lead the nation, not just to oversee the nation. Even though he considered himself a disciple of Jefferson, there are some important contradictions. Whereas Jefferson believed in the rights of states to challenge the federal government, Jackson was having none of that. The Union above all else, and the president was above that. Second, the Indian Removal Act. Jackson sympathized with land-hungry settlers in the Southwest and worked to secure the forced resettlement of Native Americans in the East to an Indian territory west of the Mississippi River. This ended the previous federal policies of negotiating with individual tribes to establish borders between the United States and tribal nations. Instead, Jackson commenced the period of removals. This act of genocide culminated in the Trail of Tears that continued into the administration of his successor, President Martin Van Buren, in 1838. Third, the nullification crisis. When leaders from the state of South Carolina, including Jackson's own first vice president, John C. Calhoun, threatened to secede from the nation rather than submit to a tariff law passed by Congress, Jackson threatened military action against these so-called traitors in South Carolina. And fourth, the Bank War. Andrew Jackson detested the national bank, as did many poor and common Southern and Western farmers. They believed the bank stood only to reward the already wealthy, to provide loans to and redirect capital to the Eastern financial interests in New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. Andrew Jackson saw the bank as his and his supporters' political enemy. When the routine process arose to renew the bank's charter, Jackson did what no other president did before him. He vetoed it. He killed the bank. And the nation fell into a disastrous financial depression in the Panic of 1837, but that didn't really matter. To his supporters, Jackson had slayed the beast. A little more about the new return to the two-party political system in the age of Jackson. The Democratic Party were the Jacksonians. They detested the growing economic inequality they saw being created by the market revolution. They believed that the federal government had gone too far, entangling itself with the commercial and financial interests of the Northeast, and had forgotten the common folk out west. This party stood for expansion and the removal of native peoples. Because this party stood for that Jeffersonian idea of a nation of farmers stretching across the continent. And yes, the expansion of enslaved labor across the continent as well. In opposition were the Whigs. Whig was a political term in England for the politicians who felt that the king had too much power. This was how they viewed Jackson, as being too king-like. The Whigs kind of had a point. Jackson did what he wanted. He threatened politicians he viewed as his enemies. He defied the Supreme Court in removing the Cherokee. He vetoed more pieces of legislation than the first 6 presidents before him combined. King Andrew I was the Whigs' most important insult. The Whigs stood for increased government interaction in building up the new capitalist market economy. They evolved the Hamiltonian vision for economic development that needed a strong and a far-reaching state power into the economy. Democrats versus Whigs would be the political actors battling for close to 30 years. Finally, let's reflect on the most important change in this age of Jackson, the United States from the 1820s to the 1840s. The era of the federal government making treaties with Native Americans ends. In the Jacksonian era, the policy would become forced removals of indigenous peoples to west of the Mississippi River. Expansion of the vote to all white men dramatically expands democracy and will drastically change politics in the United States, leading to 2 mass political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. The wishes of the Western farmers struck a decisive blow against the economic power of the Northeastern elites with Jackson's cancellation of the national bank. And finally, the role and power of the presidency expands because of Andrew Jackson's authoritarian and unilateral decisions.